Good morning and welcome to Bloomberg New Economy Conversations. In this series, we're exploring how businesses are responding to the greatest shock since World War II, the coronavirus pandemic. We're also looking to the future and asking how this crisis could reshape the world. Over the coming weeks, we're hosting conversations in which we'll imagine the post-pandemic workplace, confront the dire challenges facing emerging markets, assess next steps for the world's strained public health systems, and much more. Today's conversation focuses on the fraught dynamics of the US-China relationship. The deterioration of what is often described as the world's most consequential bilateral relationship threatens the entire system of international governance, from trade to pandemic control. What will it take to rebuild trust between the two powers? A couple of housekeeping notes. Once again, I'm coming to you from rural New Hampshire, and my setup here is a far cry from our Bloomberg live studios in New York City.
Yes.
I'd like to welcome our global community of Bloomberg New Economy delegates who've joined us at the forum in Beijing and in Singapore these past 2 years. We also welcome the thousands of listeners tuning in on social media and via the Bloomberg terminal. There will be opportunities throughout this conversation for real-time inputs from you, our audience. First, I encourage you to submit questions in the text box in the bottom right of your screen, and I'll invite you to vote in live polling in the top right of your screen. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our three guests. His Excellency Cui Tiankai is Ambassador of the People's Republic of China to the United States. He has served as China's representative in Washington since March 2013. Mr. Ambassador, a very warm welcome to you. We're very honored to have you.
Thank you very much.
Susan Shirk is chair of the 21st Century China Center at UC San Diego's School of Global Policy and Strategy and a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. She co-authored a recent letter signed by nearly 100 bipartisan former U.S. officials and China experts calling for a more productive U.S.-China relationship. Good morning to you, Susan, and apologies for the time out there in California.
No problem. Good morning.
Mikko Huotari, the Executive Director of the Mercator Institute for China Studies, a Berlin-based think tank and leading European provider of research on contemporary China. Hello and welcome, Mikko.
Thank you.
Our fourth guest is Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia and current president of the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York. Kevin was keen to join our live broadcast, but he's back home in Brisbane, where it's just after midnight right now. Nevertheless, last week, I had a chance to catch up with him. Let's watch that exchange now, after which we'll return to the live conversation. Kevin, it's great to see you. Thanks for taking the time.
It's good to be with you, Andy, on this program.
Okay, let's start with the US-China relationship. COVID-19 might have been an opportunity for these two countries to suspend their hostilities and work together on a global public health response as well as an economic rescue. In fact, the pandemic seems to have opened up a whole new battlefront. Where does the relationship go from here?
I think the fair thing to say, Andy, is that the best we can hope for is a tactical pause in hostilities, while the strategic dimensions of the relationship continue to unravel. What I mean by that is, before the COVID-19 crisis began, we had the beginnings of a tactical pause in hostilities with the Phase 1 trade deal. Then COVID arrived, and then, frankly, everything degenerated rapidly and at virtually every level of the US-China relationship. That continued until we had a telephone call between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump coming off the back of the G20 summit convened by the Saudis a couple of weeks ago. As a result of that telephone call, we have a tactical restabilization. We had, as a manifestation of that, the beginnings of the supply of Chinese medical equipment to the United States, which prior to that was simply going to China's friends and partners across the wider global BRI network. So we're into a stage of what I describe as a tactical pause and the further collapse in the overall tone and content of the relationship. But let's be very plain. Strategically, the relationship is now in fundamental disrepair. The machinery that had previously existed through the strategic and economic dialogue has virtually been rendered redundant. On top of that, the bilateral slanging match about the origins of the virus. On top of that, the other concrete elements of the relationship continue to head south rather than north. So the challenge right now, however, is for something to be salvaged out of the ashes of this. And I think that is best focused right now on concrete collaboration on a vaccine development and, frankly, collaboration in third countries once the virus hits fully the developing world to relieve the burden there conjointly rather than competitively.
You wrote recently that this year, 2020, a US presidential election year, represents a last chance saloon for US global leadership. What exactly did you mean by that?
In an overall sense, the bottom line is both the world's great powers, that is China and the United States, are emerging from this crisis, both having taken a fundamental hit in terms of their global standing. In the case of China, in terms of the failure of its own internal reporting system in the critical month of December to get the disease outbreak properly notified to both Beijing and then on to Geneva to the WHO. And then secondly, the failures in the United States, particularly in domestic management in America, but more broadly in America's America First approach to the provision of aid and assistance around the rest of the world. So my net analysis, as reflected in the piece I've just written for The Economist, is that both of these great powers emerged damaged. For the United States, however, the stakes are much higher because the United States is the existing superpower. It is the existing power which underpins the current global rules-based order, both through the UN system, the Bretton Woods institutions, the G7 and the G20. And the problem is, across all those institutions, we have seen a complete vacuum of American multilateral leadership because this president doesn't like multilateral leadership. He prefers bilats at best. In fact, his default position is unilateral rather than bilateral. And so therefore, when I say this is the last chance saloon for the United States, pointing to the election coming up this November, Trump will not change. If there's one conclusion over the last 4 years, this guy is about make America great again, putting America first, allies, goodbye, the rest of the world, go screw yourself. That, I think, sums up the new law of the jungle as seen by President Trump. So if the Democrats win, the challenge for Joe Biden is fundamental. One, to reconstruct a domestic politics in America capable of resuscitating what I've called a pragmatic Rooseveltian internationalism. Two, to convince the American body politic that America leading the multilateral order actually serves American domestic national interests. And three, rebuilding the institutions which have been allowed to crumble over the last several years. But if this does not happen, either under Republicans or Democrats, frankly, the rest of the world is just going to drift away.
Okay, so that's on the US side. On the Chinese side, what changes do we need to see in the Chinese political structure or Chinese behavior to facilitate a more productive US-China relationship and indeed a more harmonious, if you like, global global relations?
If I was advising the Chinese leadership, I think there would be two concrete changes which need to be demonstrated to the world at large. And that is that China has learnt from the lessons of its non-transparency, particularly in the December-January period, when the direct reporting system for virus outbreak put in place after the SARS epidemic in the early 2000s, that in fact in the future will work rather than be the subject of local level political interference. This therefore is a challenge to China's global transparency on disease outbreak. And whatever the propaganda apparatus may say in Beijing, international public opinion has concluded that there was a major problem here. In fact, the early reporting by Chinese media in January conceded as much. The second thing that I would recommend to our Chinese colleagues is this. For the future, whether it's in terms of assistance in PPE, personal protective equipment, ventilators, or the rest of medical advice, or on the broader question of global economic assistance, most particularly in terms of debt rescheduling, that China should do this multilaterally in partnership with other countries and through the institutions of the UN, the World Bank, and the IMF, rather than doing it bilaterally or unilaterally. That, I believe, is essential in terms of the restoration of China's future global standing as well.
What do you make of the Trump administration defunding the World Health Organization?
Well, in characteristic understated Australian style, I describe this as one of the most lunatic decisions we've seen so far from the Trump administration. And I say that not as some ideological defender of the WHO. If we stand back from the details of what's unfolded in the last several months, responsibility lies at multiple levels. It lies firstly with the early notification problems that we referred to before about China. Secondly, it arises because of the WHO's own failings in being sufficiently clear and early about its global notifications and demonstrating its absolute political independence. And thirdly, frankly, the rest of the international community not paying sufficient attention to what was said in the first place by the WHO when they eventually got round to putting their notifications out. So responsibility against any objective analysis needs to be shared around here. For the future, however, the WHO, despite its failings, the fact that its powers may be inadequate or its funding may be inadequate is a direct reflection of the failure of UN member states to address these reform needs with the WHO over the last half decade or decade. An example of that, Andy, is simply that I chaired a international review of the multilateral system in 2016. We produced a specific report on the future handling of global pandemics in 2017. None of these reform proposals were taken up by the international community. I think that therefore means that the WHO has to reform itself and member states have to. But for the future, for the United States to unilaterally pull funding out as some sort of demonstration of raw red meat to the Republican base across the United States, rather than recognizing that the WHO is all many developing countries have in terms of their line of last defense within their systems. If the virus really takes hold in Africa, Latin America, and South Asia, that's where it's just grossly irresponsible.
Nevertheless, this is the latest example of the White House taking a wrecking ball to the global order that the US itself built and sponsored. And the question now is this: does China pick up the pieces? Are we seeing right now a power shift?
I do not believe we are seeing a power shift at this point. And the reason I say that is that it's very easy in the international commentariat for people to look for these fundamental tipping points, the Suez moment, the decline and fall of the British Empire. Not wishing to be personal about this, mate, and other such moments in international relations history. The truth is these changes unfold much more gradually. But the reason I do not see it as a fundamental power shift is what I said before. both China and the United States have been fundamentally damaged by this crisis, both in their aggregate national power, the hits to their respective economies, plus in terms of their perceived global standing. That's just the reality. Therefore, I think a credible pathway to the future lies through what I've written about in The Economist and elsewhere about other credible states who are members of the G20 and even beyond the G20, what I call the multilateral seven or the M7, taking the essential institutions, the core institutions of global governance, and sustaining them, refunding them and reforming them and sustaining them until we re-establish what I call a strategic equilibrium in the wider global order vis-a-vis China and the United States and the great power contest going on there.
Kevin Rudd, thank you for being with us. As always, we value your insights.
Good to be with you, and everyone, please stay safe out there.
Thank you, Kevin. Now we're back live. There's much to consider, much to unpack in his comments. First, I'd like to turn to Ambassador Tiankai. Mr. Ambassador, we've just heard Kevin Rudd say that the best we can hope for is a tactical pause in US-China hostilities. President Trump and President Xi Jinping agreed in a recent phone call, he says, to dial down the hostile rhetoric. But just this weekend, Trump demanded consequences if China was knowingly responsible for the spread of the coronavirus, suggesting that China may have deliberately infected the world. So it seems that this truce, if that's what it was, has been short-lived. Where is all this leading?
Well, thank you very much. Let me also thank Mr. Rudd for his comments. I know him, and he has been following and studying China-US relations for a long time. I respect his views, but perhaps here I have to disagree with him a little bit. He suggested there should be a pause in the tensions between China and the United States. I think I should be hoping for more than that. Not just a pause in tensions, but really a serious rethinking of the very foundations of this important relationship. You see, for the last few years, there's been so much talk about strategic rivalry among the major powers, perhaps between China and the United States, about the so-called Thucydides trap. Now look at the situation now. An invisible virus has had such a big impact on all of us. Very few people, whether journalists or so-called strategists, ever anticipated this. So I think we really have to think hard. What are the real threats to the globe? What are the real threats to humanity? And what are the shared vulnerability for all of us, including for China and the United States? And where our true common interests lie? And how shall we define our relationship on the basis of such perception and recognition? So hopefully, this pandemic will really teach all of us a good lesson. Although some philosopher has said people seldom learn lessons from history, but I do hope we can learn a good lesson this time. And China-US relation could be based on a more realistic, forward-looking foundation. And perhaps I should also say a couple of words about a point made by Mr. Rudd just now, and also part of your question. You see, the idea of transparency. Of course, transparency is great, is good. We all need transparency. But in terms of this COVID-19 outbreak, I think that people have to see the fact this is a new virus. A few months ago, I don't think anybody has ever heard of it. Anybody has had any good knowledge of this virus. So there was a process of discovering and learning, and we are still learning. our scientists don't have definite conclusion on many aspects of this outbreak. So we're still learning. And learning will take some time. Discovery will take some time. But we are doing our best to have transparency. We are discovering, we are learning, at the same time we are sharing. So on January the 3rd, we already informed the World Health Organization there were such suspicious cases of people running fever for no clear cause. And on January the 4th, the CDC of China and the United States, the two CDCs, had their first communication about this new virus. And within days, we shared with WHO and others what we have learned about the genetic sequence of this new virus. So I think we are doing our best to have transparency. And even today, we are having daily press briefing about the latest numbers, about the latest progress in scientific research, about diagnosis and treatment of people. So, but I know you have another question, but let me finish. What worries me is indeed lack of transparency, not in terms of science, not in terms of medical treatment, but in terms of some of the political developments, especially here in the United States. You see, there's little attention being paid to the views of scientists. What is the purpose of transparency? It is to let people know the truth, know the facts, know conclusions based on science. But so little attention is paid to the views of the scientists. And some politicians are so preoccupied in their efforts for stigmatization, for groundless accusations. And honestly, some of the media people are so keen about spreading speculation or even rumors. So there's a little transparency in this regard. And what are these people up to? Why are they doing all this when our priority is to save lives? Why, at the time when we need science so badly, there are so many rumors swirling around? I think there should be a better transparency about the political agenda of these people.
Ambassador, you talk about transparency. Yesterday, Monday, Peter Navarro, who, as you know, is a senior advisor to President Trump, he's on his coronavirus task force, responsible, among other things, for supply chain issues. Navarro said that China was deliberately not sharing data on the coronavirus because China wants to be the first with a vaccine. In other words, he's saying that China looks at the development of a vaccine as being part of zero-sum competition with the United States. What's your response to that?
As I said just now, we have made it public. We have shared everything we learned with the World Health Organization and with the medical communities of other countries, including the United States. Yes, there were a couple of phone calls between President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump in the last few months. And in addition to that, there were also phone calls between the US Secretary of Health and Chinese Minister of Public Health, and also ongoing communication between the CDCs of the two countries, video conferences among the doctors and medical professionals, public health workers. It is all open and transparent. And many of the American companies, some of them I have talked to personally, many of the American companies are working with their Chinese counterparts on developing drugs or possible vaccines or other ways of protection for the people or diagnosis of the patients. So you just go and ask these American companies what they are doing.
Susan Shirk, I'd like to turn to you. As I mentioned earlier, you co-authored a letter calling for US-China cooperation, in which you made the point that even during the Cold War, the US and Soviet Union combined forces to defeat smallpox. But let's look at the challenges that exist today in order to get that kind of collaboration. I want to put up a public opinion chart. So this is a recent Harris poll, which shows that 50% of Americans surveyed say that President Trump should take a tougher stance on China. Only 17% of respondents prefer a softer stance. So my question to you is, from the point of view of politicians, what incentive do they have to improve relations with China? This is not a vote winner.
No, it's not a vote winner, but it's a lifesaver. And I think the incentive is to save lives in America and in China and in the rest of the world. Kevin Rudd said that this would, at best, we could hope for a tactical pause. That disparages that first step, which I feel is so much more important in terms of the potential impact on saving lives today and tomorrow, because there will be second and third waves of this pandemic that we need to get ready for. Public opinion in both countries has turned sharply negative. People in the United States have really soured on China. As Kevin said, this has been a progressive thing, but all the news about the initial cover-up in China and Dr. Li Wenliang as a kind of martyr to the cause of more open information, that had a big impact in China. It had a big impact in the United States. People in China have also soured on the United States because when China was enduring the first phase of this epidemic, they didn't hear any compassionate expression from the United States. What's happening here is that politicians on both sides, leaders on both sides, are feeling politically vulnerable, and therefore they're trying to deflect blame onto the other country. I mean, It's pretty depressing for an American to see that the dynamic is not that different from what's happening in China.
Susan, let me ask you about immigration. Last night, President Trump tweeted that he wants to close down immigration into the United States. What does it mean for a state like California? What does it mean for Silicon Valley, which, as we know, is heavily populated by incredibly talented Chinese scientists, researchers, entrepreneurs, many of them working on medical issues, including vaccine and therapies for coronavirus?
Well, it's, President Trump and some of his core followers have had this objective from the beginning. Basically, they want to reduce immigration to the United States. They want to build walls, and they want to return to some idealized picture of America in the good old days before all these darker-skinned immigrants came from other countries. But this is so alien to actually American tradition. What makes America great is immigration and talent, the talent of people around the world, but including and in particular Chinese people, have been a vital ingredient in American innovation in recent years. And if we really want to strengthen American competitiveness, we need to make America the place that talented people from China and other countries want to come, not to put them under this shadow of suspicion, such as the Trump administration has done with its campaign against theft of intellectual property. Of course, there is some actual theft, but a lot of the leakage of technology to China and other countries occurs at universities and other places just by virtue of the intellectual and research collaboration.
Let me ask you about that, the innovation pipeline, the talent that feeds Silicon Valley. Several 100,000 Chinese students have now left the United States, gone home, sheltering from coronavirus. Are they going to come back?
Well, it's really up to the United States, and it's up to what happens next. You know, I'm an old China hand. I've been working on China, studying China for many, many years. I haven't given up on the possibility of continuing to have a cooperative and collaborative relationship with China. And I think that it would be so self-destructive for the United States to make Chinese students feel afraid to come here because they see that this inflamed anti-China sentiment right now in the United States is jeopardizing Chinese Americans as well as people from China.
Okay, let's go to our first polling question. You see the questions up here. What is the likeliest path for global leadership coming out of coronavirus? First, US recovers its global leadership role. We see a power shift to China and the East. We have what Kevin Rudd was talking about the other day, multilateralism absent the United States and China, or anarchy. Those are the options. Pretty evenly balanced. Although it looks as though the US and China are both losers here, and we're heading towards a more multilateral global order. Mikko, China is stepping up its medical diplomacy toward Europe, trying to position itself as the responsible power in contrast to an incompetent America that is turning away from its international obligations. How is this narrative playing out in Germany and across the European continent?
Well, overall, not very well, but it's important to look at the details. So the total is really, an increase in distrust, questions about China's reliability, and ranging to much more outspoken blame, obviously, for what is probably going to be one of the most disastrous crises that the world has seen in the past decades. There's, small debates about issues with quality of equipment. There's the big debates about the lack of transparency and other measures. But the real problematic and most negatively perceived issue is how the leadership in Beijing seems to have come out of this crisis in a massive diplomatic and propaganda offensive that has created actually exactly the opposite of what was it intended to achieve. So the need for Beijing to claim space, to frame this offensively as a systemic competition, while also pushing ahead on other issues, Taiwan relations, what's happening in Hong Kong these days. All of this is creating, honestly, much more of distrust and questions about China's leadership capacity. And you've seen this in very public statements by major leaders in Europe, the chief official for foreign policy in the European bureaucracy, the UK, France, Germany, all coming out with quite explicit statements about, this being something that was not expected to some extent, but also that doesn't create a better understanding and better relationships with China. There's exceptions. Look at Italy, a very interesting case study these days in terms of understanding global power shift. And you have a genuine rethinking of relationships there. And obviously, we need to look at this very carefully going forward.
Mikko, I'd like to bring in an audience question that's just come in. It's from Spencer Dung in Shenzhen, China. Spencer is CEO of Dorabot, which uses AI and robotics to develop warehouse solutions. He asks, what would be the European Union's position toward US-China decoupling risks? How does the EU look at decoupling going on?
Well, first of all, we have to state that in policy-making circles, there's quite some understanding for some of the US positions. So a line that you hear very often is that we share the assessment in Washington, but we don't share the measures and our understanding what's required to get to the goals that we have. So in practice, we have quite some alignment on many basic ingredients of policymaking. The question whether China should be recognized as a market economy, investment screening, rethinking of export controls, also the issue of R&D cooperation. But at the same time, obviously, there's a clear recognition of the damage that all of this is doing to European interests, including multilateral institutions suffering from all of this, us being affected directly by some of the measures on both sides, tariffs, And the overall uncertainty, geopolitical uncertainty, business uncertainty, and the quite dramatic shifts that everyone who has to take decisions in these times needs to hedge their bets against this new future of potential decoupling, managing supply chain risks, etc. So it's a mixed picture. This line holds quite well. We share the assessment, we don't share the measures, and we don't like, obviously, the uncertainty and the long-term trajectory of this.
Let me ask you, Mikko, about Germany specifically. I mean, no country in Europe arguably feels more trapped between the US and China than Germany. I mean, on the one hand, obviously the US and Germany have a close security relationship. They share political, democratic values. And yet in other areas, Germany may even have more in common with China, for instance, on climate change. Which way, in the end, do you think Germany is going to turn?
Well, obviously, we're opting for Europe as the third way. And you see some of that. I'm meaning this really seriously. You have a serious debate in Europe about the need for greater strategic autonomy, and the need for industrial policies, the need to be independent to some extent also, much more unified on China policy making, but also in our relationship with the US. So first option would be to strengthen Europe and not being in a position between the two big superpowers. But in practice, indeed, I mean, what you just described plays out on a day-to-day basis. Businesses are doubling down on the Chinese market, while also taking account of new uncertainties and changing the risk assessment. But on the political level, and what we've seen over the past months, despite these really unfortunate and massive turbulences in the transatlantic relationship, there's a sense that we need to work this relationship out to make sure to survive properly in that new realities of China emerging. So, there's both. There's doubling down on China, but in political circles, I think there's a clear recognition that investment in Europe is required, and our transatlantic pillar needs to be strengthened rather than weakened.
So, Mikko, it does appear that our audience is in agreement with you on this point about the future of global order. It's come down quite decisively in favor of multilateralism, not the US and not China. Okay, let's shift the conversation a bit. We want to explore potential ways out of this mess. Where do we go from here and how? Susan, I know you're very anxious to get to this. Your letter, I must say, was full of very laudable sentiments about how the US and China need to cooperate together. I didn't see very many concrete suggestions about how that would occur. Can you talk us through the way out as you see it?
Well, right now we have a lot of active efforts on the part of philanthropists like Joe Tsai, or universities or scholars like ourselves, to try to build some connections in order to address the immediate needs of medical equipment. Believe it or not, the Trump tariffs still exist on some of this equipment, which is, talk about lunatic moves. So that's all very laudable, but I really think this does have to be led at the leadership level, at the political level, because as we noted earlier, we see public opinion growing more hostile, being led by the politicians. So I think one idea, which I know sounds maybe wild, but I think that Vice President Pence, who is the head of the working group in the United States, at least formally, and then on the Chinese side, Premier Li Keqiang, they should open up a channel. They should let the world know that they are working together. They are communicating directly on every other day basis, let's say. And the first step is to clear away the red tape and the difficulties in the movement of medical supplies. But then the two other objectives that Kevin Rudd noted, they need to start working on right now, in addition to the second and third wave. They need to work together to help the developing world and the vaccine development and distribution, because right now, when we don't know which team is going to really come up with the best vaccine is the right moment to have an agreement on how we're going to fairly share the vaccine once we have it. Once we know who are the winners of this scientific race, it's going to be much more difficult.
Let's put that to Ambassador Cui. So Kevin Rudd says that the machinery of dialogue between the US and China is now fundamentally broken. Susan has suggested that Mike Pence and Premier Li Keqiang should get together, have regular phone calls to kickstart high-level dialogue. How does that sound to you as an idea?
Well, first of all, I want to say, as far as China is concerned, we have been quite consistent. We always stand for dialogue, and we are supportive and open to all kinds of mechanisms. And almost all the changes were initiated by the US side. When you have a new administration, you have a new president in the White House, even a new Secretary of State, they would want a new mechanism with their own name on it, maybe. So we've been trying to meet their requirement to adjust, but I certainly stand for more dialogue. Fortunately, at the top level, I think there is a good working relationship between the two presidents. Whenever they meet, whenever they talk to each other on the phone, the conversation is always positive and constructive. Of course, we have to do more at somehow lower levels. But on the economic front, I think the two economic teams, they have been working very hard, very closely together for the last couple of years. That's why we had this phase 1 trade agreement. I appreciate very much the working relationship they have established in the process. And of course, we need more political dialogue and other things. And for the current priority, our joint efforts to confront this COVID-19 outbreak. Actually, I think we are, you see, for the embassy, for myself, and for people back in Beijing, we are almost in daily contact with our US colleagues, people in the administration, business leaders, or even governors, trying to facilitate the flow of medical supplies from China to the United States. And actually, maybe people are not aware of all the numbers. For instance, for this facial masks, so far, China has supplied the United States with more than 1.4 billion facial masks. That means one mask from every Chinese, about 5 masks for every Americans. I don't think many people are aware of these numbers, but we should do more. The problem is that I'm a bit concerned about, you see, at the beginning, when we try to supply people even including in European countries, with all these medical equipment, somebody was talking about China is trying to use these things for its geopolitical purposes and so on. Then a couple of weeks ago, we adopted some new measures for quality control because we want to make sure these things will meet international standards. They will be of good quality. Then people started to talk about China is blocking medical supply to other countries. I'm rather concerned about this. I would call it the ABC mindset, anything but China. I'm really worried about that.
Ambassador, you talk about a new incumbent in the White House. It looks like China is going to be a central issue in this upcoming presidential election, with Trump and Joe Biden outcompeting themselves to be tough on China. We have a question that came in from a member of our audience, David Moore Foster from Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He asks, what difference do you see in US-China relationship trajectories under the different presidential candidates, Trump and Joe Biden? Which do you prefer?
This is a question for whom?
That's for you, Ambassador.
Okay. Well, let me make it clear. We don't want to have anything to do with the U.S. domestic politics. And I don't know why we should have anything to do with it. We cannot even make sense of it. And I think as far as I can see, from my own experience of being here for 7 years, what the American people are most concerned about is their own daily life. What happens to their life, to their jobs, to the education of their kids, medical care, medical insurance, all these things. I don't think they really want to make China the centerpiece of their domestic political debate. That's my understanding.
Thank you. Mikko, before we get to you, I wanted to ask you about economics. Let's go to our next poll question. What is the near to medium term outlook for US-China relations? Here are your choices. They figure out a truce to fight coronavirus. We have a post-US election rapprochement. We get a total decoupling. And the final one, Ambassador Trey mentioned this, a Thucydides trap war. Those are your options. Mikko, let me ask you this. You've been quoted as saying that as a result of the coronavirus, China's reputation for reliability is in tatters. What does China need to do in Europe to rebuild its credibility?
Well, one of the core essentials ingredients of that will be to actually work on the welcoming of foreign companies in China, and I think it's happening. You see quite some measures and initiatives and really concrete steps also in Beijing currently these days over past weeks to make sure that what has been destroyed in terms of the trust and maybe also changed in terms of the overall risk assessment is being rebuilt. So we see some discussions and also quite high level concern on the Chinese leadership side to make sure that European investors and companies are welcome and potentially more welcome than before. But more specifically, I mean, everyone is waiting for one thing in Europe, and that's basically Europe and China agreeing on an investment agreement and clear signs from Beijing to make sure that there's progress on the long-term agenda of our relationship. And as long as this is not happening, I don't see that this trust that has been, I think, indeed in shambles for the past weeks, but I mean, relations have deteriorated for much longer. That without that, this will not change in any near term.
Okay, we have a question coming in from our audience, from Xu Chaoyou. He is the Director General of CCIEE in China, and he asks, has there ever been any fundamental trust between China and the United States since the two powers began engaging each other in the 1970s? Ambassador, has there ever been trust?
Well, I think that there have been ups and downs. But I think this is something we have always to do our best to try to achieve. I don't think that there is such a total or thorough or complete trust, even between the United States and some of its traditional allies. Maybe it's the trust is also declining, I don't know. But between China and the United States, I think this is an important issue. We have to make our best efforts to build the trust, to improve, to have better mutual confidence. But in order to achieve that, I hope our friends in America, perhaps also in Europe, could think hard about some of the basic issues. First, China has the right to develop and modernize. This right is inalienable. Number two, China has to develop and modernize along its own path. And this China path is based on China's conditions, rooted in Chinese cultures, and meet the needs of its people. Number three, China's development is not to challenge or replace the United States in the world. This has never been our intention. And there's still such a gap in terms of economic, military, and scientific power between China and the United States. We are fully aware of the gap. And China's development has not been at the expense of the United States. The so-called the view that China has taken advantage of the United States, I think is a myth. if you look at the history of the past 4 decades or so, it's clear both countries benefited from a normalized and developing China-US relationship. So it's clear if our two countries can cooperate with each other, both will benefit. If we have confrontation, both will lose. I think if people could have a clear understanding or agreement on these basic points, then it will be much easier. It's much more hopeful for us to build up our mutual trust.
Thank you. A question here from Justin Smith, who is our CEO here at Bloomberg Media. Justin asks, what are some steps and actions that US and global private sector leaders take to prevent the trend toward decoupling of the world's two largest economies? Susan, would you like to have a go answering that? What are some steps and actions the US and global private sector can take to prevent decoupling?
Well, I think some diversification of supply chains, especially on medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, is likely to occur. And the challenge is how to diversify the areas that you really don't want to be so dependent on any one source that it reduces your resiliency. That makes sense. And I think that's inevitably going to happen to a certain extent. But on the other hand, and then there's the national security side. In my view, the definition of national security has sort of bled into economic competitiveness. And the United States has expanded this national security definition to include almost all Chinese investment in the United States, for example. So I think it takes some really hard-headed, pragmatic thinking on the part of policymakers and engaging the business community again. As Mikko said, one of the big problems in the United States has been that American multinational corporations are now so frustrated with the situation in China. They have felt that they have not been able to compete on a level playing field in China, and that the state role in the Chinese economy and industrial policy in China has really started squeezing them out. And in America, when you lose the support of the business community for developing a productive relationship with China, that really cuts out one of the main constituencies in the United States. So I think the politics of relations with China have been harmed by China's government's own actions to make these businesses feel increasingly unwelcome and that it's difficult to do business in China.
Mikko, what's the view in Europe? I mean, are we going to see pulling out of China?
To some extent, yes, and basically sharing the view of Susan here. You see this overall trend where supply chain risks are being reassessed. There's a China Plus strategy in many corporate headquarters. There's an attempt to diversify, or at least work with other countries in the region more intensively. You see clearly policy debates about what is required for medical supply, but also if you look at other core technologies for emerging tech, chips, batteries, etc. There's an attempt to become more self-sufficient, or at least independent, strategically autonomous, all of that language that we hear in Europe recently. Yes, we will see some of it on the corporate side. I think there's an understanding that this will happen to some extent. But as I said earlier, I mean, there's this contradicting trend that for many companies, obviously, is absolutely essential, or they see it as essential to be in the Chinese marketplace and to continue to thrive there and build up their presence on the ground.
So let's take a look at the result of our second poll, pretty interesting. Most of you out there are optimistic. A post-election rapprochement, 49% of you believe that is the likely outcome. Nevertheless, 10%, 1 in 10, believe that we may be heading into a Thucydides trap war. Let me bring in one more question from our audience, Ambassador. This one is for you. It comes from James McGregor. He is the chairman of Greater China for APCO Worldwide, the author of Billion Customers, a book on how to do business in China. He's based in Shanghai. He says this, Mr. Ambassador, it is unfortunate to see America and China demonizing each other at this time of global crisis. Some American politicians are saying ill-considered things about China, but they are elected and independent. Their voices can't be contained, but in many cases should be ignored. A mid-level Chinese government spokesman, he said, has put out a dangerous falsehood, accusing the US military of bringing the coronavirus to Wuhan. He's a civil servant, not an independent politician. Why is he still at the spokesman's podium? Does this mean his statements about US military and Wuhan are endorsed by the leadership? Mr. Ambassador, how would you respond to Jim McGregor's question?
Well, Mr. Brown, I think something is wrong with the line. I can hear your voice, but I can't see you on the screen. But let me try to reply to your question. I think we have to really make a distinction between some of the people who are politically so much and narrowly politically motivated, and on the one hand, and the Chinese and American people on the other hand. I think all these stigmatization, blame game are played out by the small number of such politicians. But if we look at relation between the two peoples, I think we have had a long-standing friendship relationship, very friendly relation between the two peoples, well, ever since the Second World War or even earlier. And even for this outbreak, when China first confronted this COVID-19 virus, we got a lot of support and understanding from American people, American business, American institutions, or even individuals. Some of the American specialists, doctors and professors, they came to China to work with us. We appreciate this very much. And now, United States is confronting this outbreak. There's some outpouring of donations, supplies from Chinese provinces, cities, or businesses, companies like Alibaba and others. So I think the two peoples are still helping each other. I can see a deep-rooted friendly sentiment between the two peoples, and I still trust this. And hopefully, the wish of the people will eventually prevail.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm sure we could go on for at least another hour and maybe two, but we're out of time. Ambassador Cui, Susan, Mikko, thank you again. We're grateful for your participation and for your perspectives. I'd also like to extend appreciation to our fire starter, Kevin Rudd, and to our audience, both within and beyond the Bloomberg New Economy community. Thanks for joining us. We invite you to our next conversation, a focus on what comes next for global supply chains on Tuesday, May the 5th. Follow us on @NewEconForum on Twitter and visit our website at neweconomyforum.com to join future conversations and learn about other upcoming events. Thank you again and stay well.